Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. This is the first of a two-part introduction to Ordinary Grace. This one, I think, tries to just talk in general about the setting of the novel, about the world of the novel that we're going into. And the second one starts the particulars of the novel, starts talking about the characters and the plot and that sort of thing. The first thing I want to do is talk about the definition of grace. And there are several definitions. The noun, elegance or refinement of movement, when we think of a ballerina or we think of a great athlete, a wide receiver, a center fielder running gracefully, that's the elegance and refinement of movement. It can be a verb. Someone has decided to grace us with their presence, to honor us by attending, by showing up when perhaps we didn't expect them. There are, of course, religious definitions. The short prayer asking for the blessing, the idea of unmerited divine assistance given to humans for their regeneration or sanctification. There is also just the idea of the virtue that comes from God and the idea of living by grace, living through a state of sanctification. We should remember that number two and number four are certainly huge points of controversy among Protestants, among Catholics, about what exactly is involved in living in a state of grace, what is involved in what grace does for us, how one obtains grace. Those religious definitions have been the source of controversy. So, when we look at the idea of grace, I think it's important to understand that there's nothing ordinary about it. A ballerina dancing well, there is nothing ordinary about that sense of grace. The idea of getting God's unmerited favor is not an ordinary thing. So, when we're taking a look at ordinary grace, there's nothing ordinary about the concept of grace. I went to teacher school, so I think it's important that we use teacher school speak ever so often. And accessing prior learning. Titles matter. In Trail of Lightning, the characters traveled by lightning, and there was a trail of clues that led to the truth. In The Cold Dish, we had an epigraph: revenge is a dish best served cold. And at the novel's conclusion, we have what perhaps is one of the themes of the novel. It turns that phrase on its head and says that revenge is a dish best not served at all. The cold dish, revenge, is best not served at all. So the titles matter. Code Girls, was a historical account about girls who broke code, women who broke code. That title was just, this is what the subject is. But in the novels, there seems to be a few layers to the titles. So once again, we have to look at grace, ordinary grace, and see how many layers we can find in that title as we read through the novel. And again, layers. The multiple meanings of grace. Is it just going to be a short prayer? Is it going to be regeneration through God's grace? Do people have the gifts of God's grace? Are people being graced with the presence of somebody important? And is there an irony where the ordinary grace somehow becomes extraordinary. And then look, I have talked ad nauseum about character, conflict, connection, and theme. Character, how do we determine what kind of people these characters are? What can we connect the novel or characters to? The conflict is the internal and external problems the characters face. And the theme should answer the question, what's the point? I think we're going to add another C for this one. We perhaps need a sense of context. I'm not sure that the cold dish in 2004 Wyoming was that out of the ordinary for us. Wyoming is one state to the west of South Dakota. It's a little more cowboy, a little more rugged, a little more mountainous than the eastern part of South Dakota, but it's not a totally different world. And Trail of Lightning gave us a totally different world, but it was a fantasy, so we walked in understanding this was a new world. The context of Ordinary Grace, I think, is a little bit different. First, it's 1961. And because it's 1961, I was 4, all right? None of you were even a conception of your grandparents at that moment. We're dealing with a narrator who is 13. That might be something that you guys remember, but at 13, he is getting ready to move into the 7th grade, perhaps. The events are all personal, so he's telling us all of these things that happened to him, but he is telling us these events years after they occurred. He's now in his 50s, and he's talking about a time when he was 13. And so, if we're going to go 40 years, he's telling us the story in 2001, which is a far different world from 1961. I think it's also important that we have the idea of the 1960s put into proper context. I think when we think about the 60s, we think about Woodstock. We think about the Summer of Love. We think about the Vietnam War, certainly. We think about the Watts riots. Now, certainly there were some challenges to that. The Merle Haggard song, Ogie from Muskogee, trying to push back against all of that. We had a pushback from Johnny Cash with his song, What is Truth? Throughout the 1960s, and especially during the Vietnam War, there was the feeling of eve of destruction, the Barry McGuire song. But even against that, there was the feeling of good vibrations from the Beach Boys. So whether it was going retro in Ogie from Muskogee, pushing back from What is Truth that Johnny Cash sang to Richard Nixon, asking him to give us the truth about Vietnam, whether Barry McGuire was putting us into a fear of destruction or the Beach Boys dealing with good vibrations, I think that the tension produced by those dichotomies, by those, you know, juxtapositions of fear and happiness, uh, pushing forward versus wanting to go back, should cause us to remember that it wasn't all Woodstock, it wasn't all the Summer of Love, it wasn't all Vietnam, and it wasn't all Watts. Again, when we're thinking about the 60s, we're thinking about 1969. There were some bell bottom pants, there was some weird fashion trends. There were mini skirts. There was putting people on the moon. There was a certain cosmopolitan feel. Again, that was 1969. But there was also 1961. That's when the novel was set. There was, we're barely out of the 1950s. And we need to get us into 1961, not 1969. And those 8 years made a lot of difference. We probably haven't moved as fast in those 8 years as we have in, times since. I mean, there have been a lot more changes since 2020 to 2023 than there have been from 61 to 69. That said, there were still a lot of changes. So I think it's important that we forget about Woodstock. We forget about the longer hair. We forget about the hell no, we won't go, we won't fight for Texaco protests to the Vietnam War. And we go back to the Highwaymen. They had the third most popular song in 1961. And this is the time of the novel. This is the context you have to think about. And so if your image of the 60s is Woodstock, I think you have to go back and think about the Highwaymen of 1961. Also, baseball was new to Minnesota. I'm a Minnesota Twins fan. Harmon Killebrew, Bob Ellison were my first sports heroes. And I think baseball to me is important in the fact that baseball acts as a soundtrack for the novel. There's references to baseball games throughout, and I think it's important to think about baseball, not football, as the key to this novel. It's set in the summer. It's giving us this idea of Killebrew, Ellison, the Minnesota Twins. It's not talking about the Minnesota Vikings. And I think it's important to remember that the Twins were an expansion team. They were previously the Washington Senators. They had a deep, dark, rich tradition. They were part of the 50s. The Vikings were, brand new. They were a brand new organization with no connection to anything. And so that I think is important. And if I said earlier that the Twins were an expansion team, they were not. They were previously the Washington Senators. They moved to Minnesota to become the Twins. In the link, there'll be, or in the description box, excuse me, there'll be a link to George Carlin's Baseball versus Football. I'm going to play it in class. But the idea of baseball being a simpler game, the idea of football being, for lack of a better word, more militaristic, that I think is going to be an important element of thinking about this novel. We're going to deal with a simpler time, and we're going to deal with grace in multiple ways. 1961 was a time of innocence, but going from 12 to 13, moving into adulthood, is going to be talking about a loss of innocence. And I think it's important to remember that context is going to matter during this discussion. How we can put things in context is going to be important. So this is going to wrap up part one of the introduction. The next video, the next presentation, we'll start talking about the novel specifically. Hope to see everybody all in class in the next class period. Hope everyone has a good day.